They called him a monster, refused to even sell him a box of colored pencils. But on that very same day, the earth answered Naruto's pain. A single sapling rose from the ground, revealing a legendary power thought to have vanished forever. And when the third Hokage tested Naruto's chakra, he discovered something so impossible that it shook everything he knew about the shinobi world. This wasn't just the return of wood release. This was the birth of a legend. The bell above the shop door rang once, cheerful and bright, utterly unaware of the cruelty it was announcing. "We don't serve your kind here." The woman behind the counter said it without raising her voice, without even looking up fully from the ledger she was pretending to read. That was somehow worse than if she had shouted. Shouting would have meant Naruto mattered enough to provoke anger. This was something else, the particular, practiced indifference of someone who had said the same words to the same small boy more times than she cared to count, and had long since stopped feeling anything about it at all. Naruto Uzumaki stood just inside the doorway of the stationery shop, a few coins clutched in his fist, sweat cooling on the back of his neck from the summer heat outside. He had wanted new colored pencils, that was all. A boy in his class, Kiba, loud and grinning, surrounded always by friends, had shown off a set of them during free period, 12 colors in a tin box, and Naruto had stared at them the way other children stared at sweets in a window. He was 8 years old, and he had thought foolishly that this might be the day it would be different. "I have money," he said, holding up his fist as if the coins could argue on his behalf. "See? I can pay just like anybody else." The shopkeeper's eyes flicked toward him at last, cold and flat, the kind of look adults gave to something they wished would simply cease to exist through the sheer force of being ignored. "I said we don't serve your kind. Now get out before I call someone." Someone. Naruto knew what that meant. It meant the shinobi who patrolled the market district, the ones who would look at him with that same flatness in their eyes and walk him firmly, never gently, back toward the small apartment building where he lived alone, and who would mutter things under their breath that he was not supposed to hear but always did. He left. He always left. There was no point in staying, no version of this scene that ended with him walking out holding a tin of colored pencils. He had learned this lesson so many times that it should not have hurt anymore, and yet it did, every single time, fresh as the first. The village of Konohagakure sprawled bright and busy around him as he stepped back out into the street, banners strung between shop fronts for some minor summer festival, children his own age running past in small clusters with ice cream dripping down their wrists, parents calling out to them with easy, unthinking affection. Naruto walked through all of it like a stone dropped into a stream. The world simply flowed around him and did not stop. He did not cry. He had decided a long time ago, in the private ceremony that children sometimes hold with themselves, that he would not cry over this anymore. Instead, he walked, hands stuffed into his pockets, jaw set, until the crowded streets thinned and gave way to the quieter training grounds near the eastern edge of the village, a patchwork of scarred earth, splintered logs, and old target posts where genin practiced, and sometimes lonely 8-year-olds went to be lonely somewhere nobody would bother to chase them off from. The training ground was empty at this hour, the afternoon sun slanting long and gold through the trees that ringed its edge. Naruto flopped down against the base of one of the practice posts, drew his knees up to his chest, and glared at nothing in particular. "Stupid pencils," he muttered. "Didn't even want them that bad anyway." This was, of course, a lie, and he knew it was a lie even as he said it, which somehow made him angrier. He picked up a stone from the dirt beside him and threw it hard at the nearest wooden post. It struck with a satisfying thwack and dropped to the ground. He threw another. And another. Each one a little harder than the last, until his arm ached and his breathing had gone ragged, not from exertion but from something tighter and hotter sitting behind his ribs. "Why," he said to the post, as if it might answer him, "does everybody hate me? I didn't do anything." The post, unsurprisingly, said nothing. Naruto had asked this question of many things over the years. The ceiling of his apartment at night, the surface of the water in the wash basin, the empty swing at the orphanage playground where the other children had never quite let him sit with them even before he was moved out on his own. He had asked teachers, in the careful, testing way a child asks a question he already suspects has an answer too dangerous to hear. He had asked Old Man Hokage once, bluntly, over bowls of ramen, and had been given only a sad smile and a promise that he would understand when he was older, the sort of answer adults gave when they meant never. He picked up a final stone, larger than the rest, and this time did not throw it. He simply held it, turning it over and over in his small hands, feeling the rough grain of it, the cool weight. Something about the stone reminded him, absurdly, he thought, of the stubborn, obstinate feeling in his own chest. Heavy. Immovable. Unwanted by anyone, sitting in the dirt until some kid picked it up out of spite. I'll show them, he said quietly, to the stone, to the post, to nobody. Someday I'm gonna be Hokage. And then everybody's gonna have to look at me. They won't be able to just walk past like I'm not even there. He closed his eyes. He did not know, in that moment, what chakra was, not really, not in the way the academy would eventually teach him, with diagrams of coils and points and careful breathing exercises. He only knew the hot, coiling sensation that sometimes built in him when he was upset, a pressure behind his sternum that wanted out, that wanted to do something, to prove something, to be seen. He squeezed the stone in his fist and pressed his palm flat against the earth beside him, the way he sometimes did when he wanted to ground the anger, to push it down into something solid instead of letting it climb up into his throat and come out as tears he'd promised himself he wouldn't shed. And the earth answered him. It began as a faint tingling, easy to mistake for pins and needles from sitting too long in one position. Naruto barely registered it at first, too lost in his own simmering thoughts. But the tingling spread, moving up through his wrist in a slow crawl, and beneath his palm the packed dirt of the training ground began, impossibly, softly, to shift. He opened his eyes. A thin green shoot, no thicker than a blade of grass, had pushed up through the soil directly beneath his hand. As he watched, frozen, it thickened, darkened from pale green to a woody brown, and began, with a small and delicate rustling sound, to grow. Naruto snatched his hand back as if burned. What? The shoot did not stop growing simply because his hand had left it. It continued for another few seconds, swaying gently though there was no wind, reaching perhaps the height of his forearm before it seemed to run out of whatever strange momentum had driven it, and settled, still, into an ordinary-looking sapling standing crooked and small in the middle of the training ground where no sapling had been a minute before. Naruto stared at it. He stared at his hand. He stared at the sapling again. That's not normal, he said aloud, in the flat, wondering tone of a child confronting something genuinely outside the boundaries of what he understood the world to contain. Trees don't do that. He reached out, hesitant, and touched one of the small leaves that had already unfurled along the thin trunk. It felt real. It felt like an ordinary leaf, faintly rough along its edges, smelling faintly of green sap when he rubbed it between his fingers. A slow, uncertain grin began to spread across his face, chasing away the anger of a few minutes before as thoroughly as sun burning off morning mist. Did I do that? He asked the sapling, delighted now in the abrupt, whiplash way that children could be delighted, grief and joy sitting only a heartbeat apart. I did that. I totally did that. He pressed his palm back against the dirt beside the sapling, screwing his face up in concentration, trying to recapture whatever strange, hot feeling had produced the first shoot. Nothing happened. He tried again, harder, holding his breath until his face went red. Still nothing. Ah, come on, he muttered, sagging. Do it again. Please? He sat there for the better part of 20 minutes, trying every combination of scrunched-up concentration and remembered anger he could summon, occasionally managing the faintest tingle in his palm but nothing that produced so much as a single blade of unusual grass. Eventually, frustrated in an entirely new way, this time the frustration of a child denied a magic trick he just discovered he could do, he gave up, flopped onto his back in the dirt, and stared up at the sky through the branches of the real, ordinary, non-magical trees that ringed the training ground. Whatever, he said to the sky. I'll figure it out. I always figure stuff out eventually. He did not know that, 300 meters away and 1 story up in the Hokage's tower, an old man had gone very still at his desk, a brush lifted halfway to a scroll, ink slowly beading and dripping unnoticed from its tip. Hiruzen Sarutobi, 3rd Hokage of Konohagakure, had not risen to his position and survived within it for as long as he had by ignoring strange things. In a shinobi village, strange things were rarely coincidences, and coincidences were rarely without consequence. He had been in the middle of reviewing supply requisitions, the least glamorous and most constant burden of his office, when he felt it, a brief, unmistakable pulse of chakra from the eastern training grounds, the kind of signature that made the small hairs on his forearms rise beneath his robes. It was faint. It was fleeting. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds before vanishing entirely, as though whoever had produced it did not know they had done so and had immediately let it go. But brief as it was, Hiruzen recognized it, because he had felt something achingly, painfully similar exactly once before in his very long life, and he had never expected to feel it again. Would release. His brush slipped from his fingers entirely, clattering onto the desk and smearing a dark line of ink across the requisition form he'd been signing. He did not notice. He was already on his feet, crossing to the window that looked out over the eastern quarter of the village, scanning the rooftops and treetops as though he might somehow see the chakra signature itself hanging visible in the afternoon air. Impossible, he thought, even as every trained instinct in his chakra sense insisted otherwise. There is no one left alive who carries that bloodline. Hashirama-sensei is gone. His children are gone. The Senju clan has been reduced to Tsunade, and Tsunade has never once in her life, manifested would release. It is not hereditary in the way ordinary elemental affinities are hereditary. It should not simply appear. And yet, he stood at the window for a long moment, hands folded behind his back, an old habit from decades of quiet contemplation, turning the sensation over in his mind. It had not felt like a fully realized technique. No wood clone, no vast forest erupting from the earth, nothing on the scale of what he remembered from his own teacher's terrifying, beautiful power. It had felt small. Untrained. Accidental, even, a flicker, gone as quickly as it came, the chakra equivalent of a child stumbling and catching themselves before they fully fell. A child, he thought, and something in his chest tightened. He was Hokage. He could summon any shinobi in the village to investigate a chakra anomaly, and have a full report on his desk within the hour. That was not, he decided almost immediately, what this situation called for. If his suspicion was correct, if somewhere in his village a child had just manifested, however faintly, a bloodline limit thought extinguished with the death of the first Hokage, then the very last thing that child needed was a squad of ANBU descending on them like they were a threat to be contained. He needed to see for himself. Quietly. Alone. Hiruzen was old enough that his knees complained about long walks and his eyes were not what they once had been, but he was still the professor. Still a shinobi who had earned that title through decades of battlefield mastery, and he moved now with the unhurried, deliberate speed of a man who did not need to rush because he had long ago learned exactly how much time any given task required. He left the tower through a side door, shed the ceremonial outer robe of his office in favor of a plain traveling cloak that any elderly civilian might wear, and made his way toward the eastern training grounds on foot, letting the ordinary bustle of the village swallow him up as thoroughly as it swallowed anyone else. He found the boy exactly where his instincts told him he would, lying flat on his back in the dirt of Training Ground 7, arms folded behind his head, staring up at the canopy above him with an expression of stubborn, half-formed satisfaction, the look of a child who has gotten away with something and is deciding whether to be proud of it or worried about it. Hiruzen recognized him instantly, of course. There were not many children in the village whose faces he knew as well as his own, not many who bore whisker-like markings on each cheek, not many whose birth he had personally overseen under circumstances so grave and so secret that he still, 13 years later, sometimes woke in the night remembering the weight of the responsibility that had been placed into his hands alongside the wailing infant. Naruto, he said, keeping his voice gentle, unhurried, the voice of an old man out for an evening stroll rather than a Hokage investigating a chakra anomaly. Naruto sat bolt upright so fast he nearly toppled over, scrambling to his feet with the guilty haste of a child caught doing something he suspects, without quite knowing why, that he is not supposed to be doing. Old man! I mean, Hokage-sama. I was just sitting here, I wasn't doing anything. At ease, Hiruzen said, and could not entirely suppress the small smile that tugged at the corner of his mouth. Even now, even carrying the weight of what he suspected he was about to discover, there was something disarming about the boy's transparent, scrambling honesty. Naruto had never learned to lie well, a fact that had gotten him into no small amount of trouble over the years and which Hiruzen privately considered one of his more endearing qualities. I am simply out for a walk. It is a fine afternoon for one. Naruto relaxed marginally, though his eyes remained wary in a way that made something ache quietly in the old man's chest. Children should not have to learn wariness around kindly old men taking walks. But this particular child had learned a great many things too early, through no fault of his own. Hiruzen let his gaze wander, apparently idle, across the training ground, and stopped, with an expression of carefully manufactured curiosity, on the small sapling standing crooked in the middle of the clearing. Now that, he said, is interesting. I don't recall a tree growing there the last time I walked this way. He watched Naruto's face very closely as he said it, and was rewarded, or perhaps rewarded was not the word, given the gravity of what he was confirming, with the unmistakable flicker of surprise and guilt that crossed the boy's features. That's Naruto scratched the back of his head, a nervous habit Hiruzen had noted many times before. That's kind of a weird story, actually. I have time, Hiruzen said, and settled himself, with the careful deliberateness of an old man's joints, onto a nearby stump. Tell me. And so, haltingly at first and then with mounting, irrepressible excitement, Naruto told him. The shop. The pencils. The anger, sitting hot in his chest. The stone gripped in his fist, the hand pressed flat against the dirt, and then, the shoot, pushing up through the earth as though summoned by nothing more than his own frustrated will. And then it grew, Naruto said, gesturing at the sapling with both hands, his earlier misery entirely forgotten in the retelling. Like, really fast. And I tried to do it again but I couldn't, no matter how hard I tried. But it definitely happened. I'm not making it up. I know it sounds crazy. I believe you, Hiruzen said quietly. Naruto stopped mid-gesture, blinking. You do? I do, Hiruzen said. He rose from the stump, moved to the sapling, and crouched beside it with the slow care of old bones, examining the small tree with an expression Naruto could not quite read, something that looked almost like grief, layered thin over something that looked almost like wonder. He reached out and touched one of the leaves, exactly as Naruto had done, rubbing it gently between two fingers. The chakra signature, faint as it was in the plant itself, confirmed what he had felt from his office window. There was no mistaking it. No other technique in the shinobi world produced quite this particular texture of chakra, this specific harmonizing of wood nature transformation that fused the properties of earth and water into something that was, in the truest sense, alive. Naruto, Hiruzen said, still crouched by the sapling, not looking up. How much do you know about the first Hokage? Naruto blinked at the apparent change of subject. Not that much? He founded the village, right? With the old Uchiha guy. And he could do some kind of super powerful jutsu. Everybody always talks about him like he's this huge legend. He was, Hiruzen said. Hashirama Senju. My teacher, in fact, in the earliest days of my training, though by the time I knew him well he had already become Hokage and I only a young student among many. He was, without exaggeration, one of the most powerful shinobi ever to have lived. And the reason for that power, one of the reasons, at least, though there were many, was a rare and unique ability. A bloodline limit, we call such things. An ability passed down, when it is passed down at all, through blood and birth, that cannot be taught to those who do not carry it no matter how hard they train. He straightened, his knees cracking audibly, and turned to face Naruto directly. That ability was called wood release. The power to grow, shape, and command living wood, to birth forests where none existed, to raise walls and towers of living timber in the middle of a battlefield, to grow creatures of wood that could act as guardians or soldiers. It was said that when Hashirama-sensei fought at the height of his power, mountains changed shape and rivers changed course to accommodate the forests he raised in a single afternoon. Naruto's mouth had fallen slightly open. That's so cool. Wait. His eyes went wide, understanding dawning with visible, comic slowness across his face. Wait, are you saying, that's what I did? I am saying, Hiruzen said carefully, that the chakra signature of the technique that grew that sapling is identical, in every meaningful respect that my old senses can determine, to the wood release techniques I watched my teacher perform many, many years ago. Yes, Naruto. I believe that is what you did. For a long moment, Naruto simply stood there, processing this, his expression cycling rapidly through disbelief, delight, confusion, and something more complicated that Hiruzen suspected the boy himself could not have named, something in the neighborhood of why me, though whether it was the why me of dread or the why me of hope, Hiruzen could not yet say. But that doesn't make sense, Naruto said finally, some of his excitement curdling into confusion. You said it's like a family thing, right? Passed down through blood? I don't have any family. I mean, I don't have parents. I've never had parents. Everybody at the orphanage always said. He cut himself off, jaw tightening, an old and well-worn hurt crossing briefly over his features before he visibly shoved it back down. So how could I have some fancy old clan's special ability if I'm not from any clan? It was, Hiruzen thought, a remarkably sharp question for an 8-year-old, and it was a question he did not have a satisfying answer to. I do not know, he admitted honestly. It is possible there is a connection through your family that even I am not aware of. Birth records from the chaos of the Second and Third Shinobi World Wars are not always complete, and bloodlines have a way of surfacing in unexpected branches after many generations of dormancy. It is also possible that what you possess is not, in fact, an inherited manifestation of the exact same bloodline, but something new entirely, a similar ability arising through different means. I have lived a very long time, Naruto, and I have learned that the world is stranger, and chakra is stranger, than even those of us who study it for a lifetime ever fully comprehend. He did not say the other thought sitting cold and heavy at the back of his mind, that there was a third possibility, one that made his stomach twist with old, familiar dread whenever he allowed himself to consider it directly. Naruto's birth had not been an ordinary birth. The seal that bound the great fox spirit within him had not been an ordinary seal, crafted in haste under circumstances of extraordinary danger by a man giving his own life to cast it. Hiruzen did not know, could not know, without investigation he was not prepared to undertake today, in an open training ground, with the boy himself standing 3 feet away, whether that seal, that unique confluence of chakra both mortal and otherwise, might have done something to Naruto that no ordinary child's chakra network would ever experience, might have opened some door that would otherwise have remained forever closed. It was, he decided, a question for another day. A question, perhaps, that need never be answered at all, if the alternative explanations prove sufficient. Regardless of the cause, he said instead, what matters now is what you do with it. And that, Naruto, is why I would like to ask you a few more questions, and perhaps run a small test. Would that be all right? Naruto, who a moment before had been wrestling visibly with old grief, brightened again with the swiftness that Hiruzen had come to recognize as one of the boy's most defining and most precious qualities, an almost supernatural resilience of spirit that refused to stay crushed for long. Yeah. Definitely. What kind of test? Hiruzen reached into the sleeve of his traveling cloak and withdrew a small, worn leather pouch he had thought to bring along on instinct alone, not yet knowing, when he left the tower, exactly what he would find but suspecting he might need it. From the pouch, he produced a thin sheet of pale paper, unremarkable in every visible way. This, he said, holding it up, is chakra paper. It is made from a particular tree grown and treated with a particular chemical process, which reacts to the natural chakra element, the affinity, of anyone who channels chakra through it. Every shinobi, upon reaching a certain stage in their training, is tested with paper such as this, to determine which of the 5 basic nature transformations comes most naturally to them. It is usually one of the first steps in any child's ninja education. So it's like a test to see what kind of jutsu I'll be good at? Naruto asked, taking the paper carefully from Hiruzen's outstretched hand and turning it over between his fingers as though expecting it to do something dramatic on its own. In essence, yes. If your affinity is fire, the paper will burn. If it is wind, the paper will split down the middle. If it is lightning, the paper will crumple and wrinkle. If it is earth, the paper will turn to dust or crumble apart. And if it is water, Hiruzen said, watching the boy's face closely, the paper will become damp, as though soaked through. What about the wood thing? What happens for that? Wood release does not typically register on standard chakra paper at all, Hiruzen said. It is not one of the 5 basic nature transformations, but rather what we call a Kekkei Genkai, a bloodline limit, formed from the combination of two of the basic natures, in this case earth and water, fused together in a way that produces something entirely new. The paper is not designed to detect it. What I am curious about, he continued, and here, despite himself, his voice took on a slightly different quality, an edge of genuine scholarly curiosity that had not fully surfaced in decades, is what your paper shows for the ordinary 5 affinities. If you carried the capacity for wood release, it stands to reason you must carry natural affinity for both earth and water beneath it. I am curious to see if that theory holds, and, if I am entirely honest with you, Naruto, I am curious to see what else this paper might reveal about you. He did not say why he felt that particular flicker of unease as he said it. He did not yet have words for the suspicion crystallizing somewhere at the edge of his considerable experience, a suspicion born of nothing more concrete than the strange and singular circumstances of this particular child's birth, and the stranger, more singular chakra that had shaped him from his very first breath. Simply channel a small amount of your chakra into the paper, Hiruzen instructed. The way you did to grow the sapling, but gentler. You do not need anger or great effort. Simply let your chakra flow into it, the way you would let water flow through your fingers. Naruto nodded, his expression settling into a rare and endearing look of intense concentration, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth. He held the paper flat between both palms, closed his eyes, and carefully, tentatively, the way a child takes their first uncertain steps on ice, pushed a thread of chakra into it. What happened next made Hiruzen very nearly drop his pipe, which he had, out of long habit, withdrawn from his cloak sometime during the conversation without lighting it. The paper did not simply burn, or split, or crumple, or dampen. It did all 5. For one suspended, silent moment, Hiruzen simply stared. The single sheet of chakra paper in Naruto's hands had, in the span of perhaps 2 seconds, ignited briefly along one edge, a small curl of orange flame that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared, leaving a faint blackened scorch mark. Simultaneously, a jagged tear had split the paper nearly in half down its center, as though torn by an invisible wind. The two halves, in turn, had crumpled inward on themselves with small, papery wrinkles, exactly as lightning affinity paper was known to do. When Naruto's fingers pressed against it, the paper had begun to disintegrate at the very edges into fine, dry dust. And across the whole surface, everywhere that was not already burnt, torn, crumpled, or crumbling, a faint sheen of moisture had spread, as though the entire sheet had been dipped, however briefly, into water. Naruto opened his eyes, looked down at the ruined, multi-fractured remains of paper still somehow, barely, holding together in his hands, and made a small, confused noise. He said. Is it supposed to do that? Hiruzen did not answer immediately. He could not, for the simple reason that he did not entirely trust his own voice in that moment to come out steady. In 60 years, he thought, with the peculiar, hollowed-out clarity of a man confronting something genuinely without precedent in his very long and very thorough experience. In 60 years of service to this village, in a lifetime spent studying chakra theory, training shinobi of every conceivable natural affinity, reading every historical record this village possesses on unusual bloodlines and rare talents, I have never once heard of a single human being manifesting simultaneous affinity for all 5 basic chakra natures. It was not, strictly, supposed to be impossible. Chakra theory did not forbid it in the way it forbade, say, a person having no chakra at all and still using techniques. It was simply, vanishingly, almost fantastically rare, the kind of thing spoken of in old scrolls with the same breathless uncertainty usually reserved for legends of ancient sages and long-dead gods of shinobi myth. Most shinobi possessed one dominant affinity their entire lives. A gifted few, through great effort and greater talent, might master a second nature transformation well enough to combine the two into something new, the way Hashirama himself had done with earth and water to create wood release. A truly exceptional handful across all of recorded history had been documented mastering 5. All 5, at once, on the very first attempt, with no training whatsoever, from an 8-year-old boy who had never held a kunai with proper form. Hokage-sama? Naruto said, uncertain now, his earlier delight visibly curdling into worry at the old man's prolonged, uncharacteristic silence. Did I break it? Sorry, I didn't mean to break it, I can pay you back for it if you tell me how much. You did not break anything, Naruto, Hiruzen said, and was relieved to hear that his voice, when it finally emerged, sounded steadier than he felt. You have simply done something that I have never, in 60 years, witnessed a single other person do. He crouched down again, this time to look Naruto directly in the eye, close enough that the boy could not look away or retreat into the small, deflecting jokes he so often used to armor himself against the tension he did not know how to handle. Naruto, listen to me very carefully. There are 5 basic natures of chakra transformation that every shinobi's ability is built upon: fire, wind, lightning, earth, and water. Every jutsu that relies on elemental chakra draws from one or more of these 5. In the same way, every color in a painting is built from a handful of basic pigments. Most people who become shinobi discover, through this very test, that they have a strong natural talent for exactly one of these 5. A very small number of exceptionally gifted shinobi, across an entire lifetime of hard training, manage to develop real strength in 2, and rarer still, 3. What you have just shown me, on this piece of paper, in your very first attempt, at the age of 8, having never trained a single day of your life in chakra nature manipulation, is affinity, however faint and untrained it may currently be, for every single one. Naruto stared at him. Then he looked down at the ruined paper in his hands, as though it might rearrange itself into something more comprehensible if he simply looked hard enough. So, he said slowly, working through this with the careful, deliberate logic children sometimes brought to bear on things too large for them, I'm not just the wood thing. I've got all of them? Fire and wind and lightning and earth and water, all at the same time? It would appear so, Hiruzen said. Is that? Naruto hesitated, and something in his voice made Hiruzen's chest ache all over again, an old and familiar ache that had settled there 13 years ago and never fully left. Is that a good thing? Or is that, like, a scary thing? 'Cause everybody always looks at me kind of scared already, and if I'm gonna be some kind of, I dunno, weird 5 elements monster on top of everything else, maybe I should just, Naruto. Hiruzen's voice came out sharper than he intended, though not unkind, and it was enough to cut the boy off mid-sentence. Look at me. Naruto looked at him. You are not a monster, Hiruzen said, with the particular, weighted certainty of a man who had said this same phrase, in one form or another, more times over the years than he could easily count, and who had come, over those years, to understand with painful clarity just how badly the boy in front of him needed to hear it, and just how little the village around him had ever bothered to make him believe it. You are a child who has been given, through means I do not yet fully understand, an extraordinarily rare and extraordinarily powerful gift. Gifts of this magnitude are not curses. They are responsibilities, and responsibilities, Naruto, are not the same thing as monstrousness. Do you understand the difference? Naruto did not answer immediately. He looked down at the scorched, torn, crumpled, dust-edged, damp remains of the chakra paper still held loosely in his hands, and something in his young face worked through several emotions in quick succession before settling, tentatively, on something that looked almost like hope trying very hard not to be crushed before it had a chance to grow. I think so, he said quietly. Kind of. Maybe you gotta explain it a couple more times before it really sticks. Despite everything, despite the enormity of what he had just witnessed, despite the tangled knot of implications now sitting heavy in his mind, Hiruzen found himself smiling, a real smile, unguarded. I imagine I will have ample opportunity to explain it a great many more times before we are through, he said. That, Naruto, I can promise you. They sat together for a while longer in the quiet training ground, the afternoon sun sliding lower and turning the light around them a deepening amber. Hiruzen asked more questions, careful, probing, but gentle, the questions of a healer taking a careful history rather than an interrogator seeking a confession. Had Naruto ever felt anything like this before? Any strange warmth, any unusual sensations of tingling or pressure, any moments where something around him had moved or changed in ways he could not explain? Naruto, thinking hard, offered a handful of half-remembered incidents that Hiruzen filed away carefully in his mind. A puddle of water that had once risen up around his ankles during a bad rainstorm and seemed, in retrospect, to have moved with unusual purpose rather than simple gravity. A small patch of grass behind the orphanage that the other children had once teased him for, claiming it grew strange and wild wherever he sat too long. A single vivid memory, 3 years old now, of a candle flame flaring suddenly bright and hot when he'd been crying alone in his room. Bright enough that he'd been frightened and blown it out immediately, and never mentioned it to anyone. Each story, individually, could have been coincidence, imagination, the ordinary embellishments of childhood memory. Together, laid out in sequence before a man who understood exactly what he was looking for, they painted a picture that left no real room for doubt. This gift, whatever its true origin, whatever strange convergence of blood and circumstance had produced it, was not new. It had been present, faint and untrained and unrecognized, for years, flickering at the edges of a lonely child's life without anyone, including the child himself, understanding what they were witnessing. How much of this, Hiruzen wondered, watching Naruto pick idly at a loose thread on his sleeve as he talked, have I missed, simply because I did not know to look for it? How much of what this village calls chaos and trouble when it comes to this particular boy has, in truth, been the quiet, confused stirrings of a power neither of us understood? It was a sobering thought, and beneath it lay a colder, more urgent one that Hiruzen could not afford to set aside for long: the question of what came next. He could not simply let this knowledge sit undisturbed. A gift of this magnitude, left entirely untrained, was not merely wasted potential, it was, quite plainly, a danger. To Naruto himself, first and foremost, an 8-year-old with access to 5 elemental chakra natures and a Kekkei Genhai besides, discovering and experimenting with these abilities alone, without guidance, without any understanding of the discipline and control such power demanded, was an 8-year-old who could very easily hurt himself, or others, entirely by accident. Hiruzen had seen, more than once in his long career, what happened when raw talent outpaced the wisdom and restraint needed to wield it safely. But there was a second danger, quieter, and in some ways more troubling, and it was this danger that occupied the greater portion of Hiruzen's thoughts, as the sky slowly reddened toward evening. Konoha was not, whatever its founding ideals and however proudly it wore the title, a village free of ambition, jealousy, or the darker calculations of those who saw people not as people but as assets to be leveraged. If word of this got out, if it became known, beyond the two of them sitting here in this quiet training ground, that the boy everyone in the village either feared or ignored was, in fact, a walking repository of chakra potential unlike anything seen in generations, the consequences could unfold in any number of directions, and precious few of them were good. There were elders on the council who would see, in Naruto's gift, not a child to be nurtured but a weapon to be forged, and forged quickly, with little regard for the boy underneath the potential. There were clans who might see a threat to their own carefully guarded bloodline prestige, or, worse, an opportunity to be exploited through marriage alliances or adoption schemes dressed up as generosity. There were, Hiruzen knew with the particular weariness of a man who had watched this exact pattern play out too many times before, those within his own administration, men like Danzo, whose loyalty to the village was unimpeachable and whose methods were, and had always been, a source of deep and ongoing concern, who would view a child with this much raw power as something to be quietly acquired, molded, and controlled, with or without that child's own understanding or consent. And there was, underlying all of it, the simple, brutal truth of how this village already treated Naruto Uzumaki. A village that shunned him for a burden he had never chosen to carry was unlikely to greet the revelation of extraordinary hidden power with warmth and welcome. More likely, Hiruzen suspected grimly, it would greet it with fear compounded upon fear, the belief, however irrational, that the boy who was already whispered about as dangerous had just become, in the eyes of the frightened and the small-minded, more dangerous still. No. This could not become common knowledge. Not yet. Perhaps, if Hiruzen had his way, not for a very long time, not until Naruto himself was old enough, strong enough, and secure enough in who he was to weather whatever storms such knowledge would inevitably bring. Naruto, he said finally, as the last of the daylight began to fade properly toward dusk, I would like to ask something of you, and I want you to understand that I am asking, not commanding, because what I am about to suggest will require trust between the two of us, and trust is not something that can be ordered into existence. Naruto looked up at him, curious and a little wary again, the wariness that seemed to live perpetually just beneath the surface of the boy's easy grins. What is it? What we have discovered here today, your abilities, all 5 of them, and the wood release beneath them. I would like this to remain, for now, a secret between the two of us. Not because there is anything shameful in what you can do, he added quickly, seeing the flicker of old hurt cross Naruto's face at the word secret. A word that likely carried too many painful associations for a boy who had spent his whole life feeling like the subject of secrets kept specifically to exclude him. Quite the opposite. It is because what you carry is precious, and rare, and precious. Rare things are too often taken from those who cannot yet protect them. I want to help you grow strong enough, and wise enough, in the use of these gifts that when the day comes for the rest of the village to know what you are capable of, and that day will come, Naruto, I promise you that, you will be standing on ground solid enough that no one can use what you are against you. Naruto chewed on his lower lip, considering this with the peculiar solemnity children sometimes brought to decisions that mattered far more than the adults around them realized. So it's not like a bad secret. It's like a getting stronger secret. Precisely, Hiruzen said, relieved at the boy's quick grasp of the distinction. A getting stronger secret. And you'll help me? Teach me how to use it right? I will, Hiruzen said, and meant it with a depth of resolve that surprised even himself, given how the afternoon had begun with nothing more than idle curiosity about a stray chakra signature. Personally, I am, admittedly, a very busy old man with a great many duties, but I will make the time, because I do not believe this is a task I can responsibly delegate to anyone else, not yet. We will begin slowly, with control, with discipline, with the basic foundations every shinobi needs before they ever attempt true elemental technique. It will not be as flashy or as exciting, in the beginning, as growing trees out of the ground or crumpling paper with a thought, but it will be necessary, and I think, Naruto, that if you are patient with the process, you will find it worthwhile. Naruto's face had gone through its now familiar cycle of doubt and wariness and had landed, this time, somewhere Hiruzen had rarely had the privilege of seeing settle so completely. A bright, fierce, uncomplicated determination that lit the boy's blue eyes from within like a struck match. Okay, he said. I'll do it. I'll be patient in everything, I promise. And someday, he grinned, wide and gap-toothed and utterly without the guardedness he'd carried into this conversation an hour before, everybody's gonna see just how strong I got, and they're gonna have to admit I'm not just some kid who causes trouble. I'm gonna be the strongest shinobi this village has ever had. Stronger than the first Hokage, even, with his stupid trees. Hiruzen laughed, a real laugh, warm and unguarded, the kind he did not indulge in often enough these days given the weight of his office. That, he said, is an exceedingly ambitious goal, young man, but I confess, having seen what I saw today, I am no longer entirely certain it is beyond you. They agreed, before parting ways as the last light drained from the sky, on the shape of what was to come. Hiruzen would send for Naruto in the early mornings, before the academy day began and before the village at large had fully stirred from sleep, a time when two figures training quietly in and out of the way corner of the village would draw the least attention. They would start, as Hiruzen had promised, with the fundamentals, chakra control exercises meant to teach Naruto's evidently overflowing reserves of raw energy the kind of discipline and precision that would, eventually, make elemental training not just possible but safe. Leaf concentration exercises, to teach him the fine, exact control needed to hold a single leaf steady against his skin using chakra alone. Eventually, if his progress warranted it, the water walking and tree climbing exercises that formed the backbone of every serious shinobi's early training regimen. It would be slow. It would, Hiruzen suspected, occasionally be frustrating for a boy whose natural instinct ran toward loud, immediate, visible action rather than the quiet patience that true mastery demanded. But it would also, he was quietly and cautiously certain, be the beginning of something extraordinary. Provided they were careful, provided they were patient, provided the secret held for as long as it needed to hold. As Naruto turned to head home, practically vibrating with barely contained excitement despite the late hour and the long day behind him, Hiruzen called out one final thing. Naruto. The boy turned back. What you did today, losing your temper, growing that sapling entirely without meaning to. I do not say this to frighten you, but I want you to understand it clearly. Strong emotion and strong chakra are closely linked, more closely in you, I suspect, than in most. Until you have better control, I want you to be careful with your anger and your sadness when you are alone. Not because feeling those things is wrong, Everyone feels anger and sadness, Naruto, and you have more reason than most children your age to feel both, but because right now, those feelings might do things around you that you do not intend and cannot yet predict. Do you understand? Naruto's excitement dimmed slightly, replaced by something more thoughtful. Yeah, he said slowly. I get it. I'll be careful. Good, Hiruzen said, and softened his voice. And Naruto, for whatever small comfort it offers, for what it is worth from an old man who cannot undo the unkindness you experienced today at that shop, I am sorry. You deserve better than what you received this afternoon, and you will continue to deserve better, whether or not the world around you is wise enough yet to see it. That has nothing to do with what powers you carry. It is simply true, and I want you to hear it stated plainly, without qualification. Naruto looked at him for a long moment, something bright and unshed standing in his eyes that he blinked rapidly away, refusing, even now, to let fall. Thanks, old man, he said, quiet in a way that suited him rarely. Then, as if embarrassed by the sincerity of the moment, he grinned again, the expression snapping back into its usual brash shape like a rubber band released. But don't think being nice to me means I'm gonna go easy on you during training. I'm gonna get so strong you won't even recognize me. I look forward to it, Hiruzen said, and watched the boy sprint off toward his apartment, small and bright and impossibly resilient against the darkening blue of the evening sky, before turning himself and making his own slower way back toward the tower, mind already turning over the shape of lessons yet to come, and the many careful, quiet dangers that would need to be navigated to protect what he had found. That night, alone in his office long after the rest of the tower had emptied, Hiruzen Sarutobi sat at his desk with a single sheet of paper before him, not chakra paper this time, but ordinary parchment, on which he had begun, in his careful, formal handwriting, a private record meant for no eyes but his own. He wrote of the day's discovery in spare, precise language, the language of a man documenting something too significant to trust entirely to memory, however sharp that memory remain even in his advancing years, would release confirmed present, though currently uncontrolled and unconscious in its manifestation. All 5 basic natures also confirmed present at minimum threshold affinity, a phenomenon without precedent in any record I have personally reviewed or am aware of within the village archives. Subject: Uzumaki, Naruto, age 8. Origin of ability unknown. Possible explanations include undocumented bloodline heritage, spontaneous mutation, or, and I record this possibility with appropriate caution, pending further private investigation, some influence connected to the unique circumstances of the subject's birth, and the seal placed upon him at that time. He paused there, brush hovering, and considered striking the final sentence entirely. It was speculation, and speculation of a particularly sensitive nature, the kind of thing that, if this record were ever to fall into hands other than his own, could reignite questions about Naruto's nature that Hiruzen had spent 13 years working, carefully and at great personal cost, to keep from ever being asked in the first place. But he was, above all else, a thorough man, and thoroughness demanded he not omit uncomfortable possibilities simply because they were uncomfortable. He let the sentence stand, and continued, regardless of origin, the practical matter before me is one of stewardship. This gift, left untrained, represents significant danger both to the subject and to those around him. Left undisclosed to the wider village, it represents an ongoing vulnerability should its existence become known to parties who might seek to exploit it. I have elected, therefore, to undertake the subject's early elemental training personally, in secrecy, until such time as his mastery and maturity are sufficient to withstand the scrutiny that public knowledge of his abilities would inevitably invite. I am not unaware of the historical weight of what I am choosing to protect. Hashirama-sensei's gift was, in its time, spoken of as though it had been granted by some benevolent will greater than mere chance, a power meant to shape peace out of a world at war, though the peace it purchased proved, in the decades since, more fragile than any of us who fought alongside him for it ever wished to admit. Whether what young Naruto carries is truly a continuation of that same legacy, or something new and unrelated wearing a familiar shape, I do not yet know. I suspect I will not know for some years yet, if ever with full certainty. What I do know is this: the boy who grew that small, crooked sapling in Training Ground 7 this afternoon has spent the whole of his short life being told, in ways spoken and unspoken, that he is a burden, a danger, a thing to be endured rather than a child to be loved. I do not know what future this new knowledge will carve for him. I hope, with whatever hope an old man in my position is permitted to still hold on to, that it will be a kinder one than the past he has already survived. He set down the brush at last, rolled the parchment carefully, and sealed it within a hidden compartment of his desk, one of several such compartments containing documents too sensitive for the general archive, too important to destroy, too dangerous to leave in plain sight. Outside his window, the village lights glittered against the darkness, ordinary and unaware, the great sprawling life of Kanahigakure continuing exactly as it always did, indifferent to the small, extraordinary secret that had taken root that afternoon in a quiet corner of Training Ground 7, a secret with roots, quite literally, that Hiruzen suspected, with the particular foreboding clarity of a man who had lived through enough history to recognize its patterns forming anew, would eventually grow into something far larger than either of them could yet imagine. He allowed himself, before finally rising to make his way home for what little remained of the night, one small private smile. For the first time in longer than he cared to admit, watching that small green shoot push up unbidden through packed earth, watching a lonely, hurting child transform, for one bright unguarded hour, into a boy alight with wonder at his own hidden potential, Hiruzen Sarutobi had felt something he had not expected to feel again in his advancing years, something that reminded him, faintly and precious, of standing beside Hashirama Senju himself in the earliest, most hopeful days of the village's founding. He had felt hope, whatever storms lay ahead, and he did not doubt, even in this quiet moment of cautious optimism, that storms lay ahead. He intended to see this through. Whatever Naruto Uzumaki was destined to become, whatever strange convergence of fire and wind and lightning and earth and water and living wood had chosen to root itself within one small, stubborn, endlessly resilient boy, Hiruzen would do everything in his considerable power to ensure that when the world finally saw what Naruto truly was, it would see not a monster to be feared, but exactly what he had told the boy himself, with his whole heart, that afternoon, not a monster, a gift, a responsibility. And if the old Hokage had anything to say about it, eventually, a legend to rival, and perhaps even surpass, the one who had come before him. The first morning of training began before the sun had fully cleared the eastern rooftops. In the thin gray hour when the village was still mostly asleep and the only sounds were early birds and the distant clatter of a baker setting out his first trays, Naruto arrived at the designated meeting spot, a small, overgrown clearing tucked behind the Hokage monument, reachable only by a narrow deer trail that wound up through scrub trees and loose scree, nearly 20 minutes early, practically vibrating with impatience. He had barely slept. He had lain awake most of the night replaying, over and over, the memory of the small green shoot pushing up through packed dirt, of the chakra paper crumpling and tearing and burning and dampening all at once, of the old Hokage's steady, certain voice telling him he was not a monster. He had decided, somewhere around the third or fourth replaying, that he was not simply going to become a good shinobi. He was going to become the best shinobi. Today, preferably before lunch. You are early, Hiruzen observed, arriving at a pace that seemed, to Naruto's impatient eyes, almost insultingly unhurried. A simple wooden walking staff in one hand and a canvas satchel slung over one shoulder. I couldn't sleep, Naruto said, bouncing slightly on the balls of his feet. So, what are we doing first? Are we gonna grow more trees? Can I try lightning? I bet lightning would be so cool, like zap, right through stuff. We are, Hiruzen said, settling himself onto a flat stone with the careful deliberateness of aging joints, going to sit down. Naruto blinked. Sit down, Hiruzen confirmed. And breathe. The disappointment on Naruto's face was so immediate, and so total that Hiruzen very nearly laughed outright. That's it? That's the training? Old man, I already know how to sit and breathe. I've been doing it my whole life. Have you? Hiruzen said mildly. Ever done it on purpose, with your full attention, for longer than the space of a single breath? Naruto opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again, visibly reconsidering. No, he admitted. Then you have not, in fact, already learned this, Hiruzen said. Sit. Naruto sat. It was, within the first 2 minutes, one of the hardest things he had ever been asked to do. Hiruzen instructed him to fold his legs beneath him, rest his hands loosely in his lap, close his eyes, and simply notice his own breathing, not to control it, not to force it into any particular rhythm, but merely to observe it, the way one might observe a stream flowing past without trying to redirect its current. That's it, Naruto said, eyes still closed, after approximately 11 seconds. Just breathe, Hiruzen confirmed, seated a short distance away with his own eyes closed, apparently entirely at peace with the stillness that Naruto found, within moments, nearly unbearable. His mind would not cooperate. It leapt immediately to the sapling, to the chakra paper, to the shopkeeper's flat, dismissive voice from the day before, to what he might make for breakfast when this was over, to whether Iruka-sensei— no wait, he didn't have Iruka yet, that was next year— to whether his current teacher would notice if he fell asleep during lessons later from being tired, to the itch developing on the back of his left knee that he was absolutely, positively not going to scratch because that would mean breaking his pose and admitting defeat. You are thinking very loudly, Hiruzen observed, without opening his eyes. I can't help it. My brain won't shut up. It is not meant to shut up, Hiruzen said. That is not the exercise. The exercise is not silencing your thoughts. It is noticing them without chasing after every single one, the way you might notice leaves floating past on the surface of a stream without diving in after each one to see where it goes. That sounds way harder than just growing a tree. In many ways, Hiruzen said, with the faintest trace of dry amusement, it is considerably harder. Which is precisely why we are beginning here, and not with the far more exciting and far more dangerous business of shaping elemental chakra. Naruto huffed, but to his own considerable surprise, did not argue further. Something in the old man's calm, unhurried certainty made arguing feel somehow beside the point, like arguing with weather, or with the slow, patient turning of seasons. He closed his eyes again, and tried, badly, to simply notice his breathing without following every thought that wandered past. They sat like that for what felt to Naruto like several agonizing hours and was, in fact, closer to 15 minutes. All right, Hiruzen said finally, and Naruto's eyes snapped open with undisguised relief. That is enough for a first attempt. How did you find it? Awful, Naruto said immediately. My legs fell asleep and my brain wouldn't stop, and there was this itch on my knee I couldn't scratch, and honestly I don't understand how any of that is supposed to help me grow trees or shoot fire out of my hands. Good, Hiruzen said. Good? You noticed all of those things, Hiruzen said clearly, and in detail, rather than simply enduring 15 minutes of vague discomfort without understanding its shape. That noticing, that precise, unflinching attention to what is actually happening within your own body and mind, rather than the story you tell yourself about what is happening, is the foundation of everything that comes after. Elemental chakra manipulation, at its highest levels, is not brute force. It is precision. It is knowing, with exquisite exactness, the shape and texture and volume of the chakra you are moving, and moving it exactly so, no more and no less than the technique requires. You cannot learn that precision if you have never learned to sit still and notice your own breath. Naruto considered this, chewing on his lower lip in the way that Hiruzen had already come to recognize as a sign of genuine thought rather than mere fidgeting. So it's like, he said slowly, training the noticing part first, so that later, when I'm doing the actual cool stuff, I already know how to pay attention properly. Precisely, Hiruzen said, and could not entirely keep the note of pleased surprise from his voice. He had expected, frankly, a good deal more resistance from a boy whose reputation throughout the village ran heavily toward impatience and impulsiveness. That Naruto had grasped the underlying logic so quickly, even while finding the exercise itself thoroughly unpleasant, spoke to an intelligence that few in Konoha had ever bothered to look for beneath the boy's loud exterior. You possess, Naruto, a sharper mind than most people credit you with. I suspect that will serve you well in the training ahead, provided you remember to trust it even when the exercises themselves feel tedious or pointless. Naruto ducked his head, ears reddening slightly at the unfamiliar sensation of being told, plainly and without qualification, that he was smart. It was not a thing many adults in his life had ever bothered to say to him. Can we do the leaf thing now? He asked, mostly to cover the sudden awkwardness of the moment. You mentioned a leaf thing yesterday. We can, Hiruzen said, and reached into his satchel to produce a small handful of ordinary leaves, plucked that morning from a maple near the tower. This exercise will test something different, not your ability to sit still and observe, but your ability to direct a very small, very precise amount of chakra to a single point on your body, and hold it there steadily, without either too much force or too little, he demonstrated first, pressing a leaf flat against his own forehead with 2 fingers, then withdrawing his hand entirely. The leaf remained where it was, held fast by some invisible adhesion, for a long moment before finally fluttering loose and drifting to the ground. The leaf sticks to your skin through chakra alone, he explained, release steadily through the chakra points nearest wherever you place it. Too little chakra, and the leaf falls immediately. Too much, and you will find the leaf is blown away entirely, or, in more extreme cases of poor control, that you have singed it, torn it, or otherwise damaged it through excess force. The goal is the narrow, exact middle, precisely enough chakra, precisely steady, for precisely as long as you wish to hold it there. He handed Naruto a leaf. Naruto pressed it to his forehead with far more enthusiasm than technique, screwed his face into an expression of intense concentration, and promptly blasted the leaf clean off his own forehead with a visible little pulse of chakra that sent it fluttering nearly a meter away. Too much, Naruto observed, somewhat unnecessarily. Considerably too much, Hiruzen agreed, retrieving the leaf. Try again. Less. Imagine you are not pushing chakra outward with force, but rather allowing it to seep out gently, the way water seeps through a crack in stone rather than bursting through a broken dam. Naruto tried again. This time the leaf fell immediately, fluttering down to land in his lap. Now too little. This is really annoying, Naruto said, but there was no real heat in it, only the particular, focused frustration of someone genuinely absorbed in solving a puzzle rather than simply wanting to give up. He tried a 3rd time, adjusting, and a 4th, and a 5th, and by the 12th attempt, as the sun climbed properly over the rooftops, and the smell of the village's morning cooking fires began to drift up on the breeze, the leaf finally, briefly stayed. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds before fluttering loose again, but 3 seconds was enough to make Naruto let out a whoop of triumph that startled a flock of sparrows from a nearby tree. I did it! Did you see that? I totally did it. I saw, Hiruzen said, smiling despite himself at the boy's unrestrained delight over what was, in the broader scheme of shinobi training, an extremely modest accomplishment. Well done. Now do it again, and again after that. And then we will see if you can hold it for 5 seconds instead of 3, and then 10, and so on, until it requires no conscious effort at all. Naruto's face fell slightly at the prospect of repeating the exercise dozens more times, but he set his jaw, pressed the leaf back to his forehead, and tried again. They trained like this for the better part of an hour each morning, in the quiet clearing behind the monument, before Naruto had to hurry off to whatever schooling arrangement currently occupied his days, for at this point, still some months before his formal enrollment at the Ninja Academy, his education consisted of a patchwork of tutoring sessions arranged, quietly and at some expense, by Hiruzen's own office, ostensibly as a general kindness to a ward of the village, but in truth as a deliberate effort to ensure the boy received at least a baseline of the reading, writing, and arithmetic instruction that other children absorbed within ordinary family homes. Day by day, the leaf exercise grew easier. 3 seconds became 5, became 10, became, by the end of the 2nd week, a solid, steady minute of unbroken concentration, the leaf sitting motionless against Naruto's forehead as though glued there by more conventional means. Hiruzen, satisfied, moved him on to holding 2 leaves at once, one on each palm, requiring him to divide his attention and his chakra output evenly between 2 separate points rather than concentrating everything on a single spot. This proved considerably harder, and Naruto's frustration, on the days when his progress stalled, occasionally flared into the kind of hot, coiling anger that Hiruzen watched with careful, wordless attention, for it was precisely that kind of anger, he suspected, that had first triggered the accidental sapling in Training Ground 7. On one such morning, after his 15th consecutive failed attempt to hold 2 leaves steady at once, Naruto slammed both hands flat against the ground in frustration, and Hiruzen felt, for one sharp instant, the telltale prickle of chakra gathering beneath the boy's palms. Naruto. Breathe. Naruto froze, chest heaving, and looked down at his own hands as though they belonged to someone else. A single thin tendril of green had begun to push up between his fingers, no more than a centimeter tall, before it stopped, quivering, and slowly withdrew back into the earth as Naruto forced his breathing to slow. "Whoa," he said quietly, staring at the small disturbed patch of dirt where the tendril had begun to emerge. That just happened because I got mad? That is precisely why we began with the breathing exercises," Hiruzen said, not unkindly, though there was a weight of seriousness in his voice that had not been present in their earlier, lighter exchanges. "Your gift, Naruto, appears to be tied more closely to your emotional state than is typical even for elemental affinity, which is already, in most shinobi, somewhat responsive to strong feeling. I do not yet fully understand why this is so pronounced in you, but I have my suspicions, and regardless of the cause, the practical reality remains the same, until your control improves considerably. Strong anger, strong fear, even strong excitement, carries real risk of triggering an unintended manifestation. This is not a reason for shame," he added, seeing the boy's face begin to fall toward the familiar shape of guilt. "It is simply a reason for continued patience and continued practice. Every shinobi must learn to master their emotions in the heat of combat or crisis. You must simply learn it somewhat sooner, and somewhat more thoroughly, than most." Naruto nodded, subdued, and pressed the leaves back against his palms with renewed, careful focus. It was during the 4th week of training, on a morning when a light drizzle had turned the training clearing damp and gray, that Hiruzen judged Naruto's control sufficiently advanced to introduce the next stage, tree climbing without hands, using chakra alone to adhere his feet to the vertical bark of a trunk. This exercise, Hiruzen explained, standing before a tall, sturdy oak at the clearing's edge, builds directly on the leaf exercise, but demands considerably more chakra, applied continuously and adjusted constantly, since your own weight and movement will require the chakra output at your feet to shift moment by moment as you walk. Too little, and you will simply slide off the trunk. Too much, and you will find yourself blasted backward, often quite forcefully, as the excess chakra repels you from the surface rather than adhering you to it. He demonstrated, walking with easy, unhurried steps directly up the trunk of the oak as though it were level ground, pausing halfway up to stand perpendicular to the earth with his hands clasped behind his back, before walking calmly back down again. Naruto's mouth had fallen open. "That is so cool. Okay, I need to learn that immediately." "You may attempt it," Hiruzen said, "though I would caution you that most genin require days, sometimes weeks, of failed attempts before achieving even a few steps of sustained adhesion. Do not be discouraged if your first attempts end in a fall." Naruto, predictably, was not remotely deterred by this warning. He sprinted at the tree with the reckless enthusiasm of a boy who had never once in his life let the phrase "most people fail at first" discourage him from immediate, full-effort attempts, planted one foot against the bark, and immediately slid straight back down onto the damp ground with an undignified thump. "Too little," Hiruzen observed. "I know," Naruto grumbled, picking himself up and wiping mud from the seat of his pants. He tried again, adjusting, and this time launched himself backward off the trunk entirely, landing hard on his back in the wet grass. "Too much." "I know, old man, you don't have to keep saying it." He tried a third time. A fourth. A fifth. By the 20th attempt, mud-streaked and thoroughly soaked from the drizzle, he had managed to keep his foot adhered long enough to take a single full step up the trunk before losing his balance and tumbling backward again. A fall Hiruzen was gratified to note the boy took in stride, literally rolling with the impact in a way that suggested some instinctive, untrained sense of body awareness already developing beneath the surface of his enthusiasm. "That's progress," Hiruzen said. "One full step is more than most genin manage on their first day of attempting this exercise. One step isn't gonna do much good if I fall on my butt right after," Naruto pointed out, but he was grinning despite the mud, despite the cold drizzle soaking through his jacket, the particular grin of a boy who had just glimpsed, faintly, the shape of a skill he was determined to master no matter how many falls it took to get there. They continued through the drizzle until Naruto's tutoring session called him away, by which point he had managed, on his final attempt of the morning, 3 full consecutive steps before the inevitable tumble, an achievement that had him practically skipping down the deer trail toward the village proper, mud-caked and soaked and thoroughly, uncomplicatedly happy. Weeks passed in this fashion, each morning building steadily upon the last. Hiruzen, watching the boy's progress with a satisfaction he found himself increasingly reluctant to keep entirely professional, began to notice changes beyond the merely technical. Naruto's fidgeting during the breathing exercises grew less pronounced. His frustration, when exercises proved difficult, took longer to curdle into the hot, chakra-triggering anger of the early weeks, replaced instead by a more settled, determined focus that Hiruzen recognized, with quiet pride, as the beginnings of genuine shinobi discipline. There were setbacks, of course, mornings when exhaustion or a particularly bad encounter with the village the day before left Naruto sullen and unfocused, unable to summon the concentration the exercises demanded. One memorable morning when a nightmare-disturbed sleep left him so distracted that he singed his own sleeve attempting the leaf exercise. A small burst of uncontrolled fire-natured chakra catching the fabric alight before Hiruzen calmly extinguished it, and spent the remainder of the session simply talking with the boy about what had disturbed his sleep rather than continuing the physical training. "You do not have to tell me," Hiruzen said gently, on that particular morning, as Naruto sat hunched and uncharacteristically quiet on the flat stone, arms wrapped around his knees. "But I have found, in my own long life, that troubles shared tend to weigh less than troubles carried alone." Naruto was quiet for a long moment, picking at a loose thread on his sleeve. "It's dumb," he said finally. "I doubt that very much. I had this dream where I finally got everybody to like me. Like everybody. The whole village. And then I woke up and remembered it was just a dream and everybody still." He stopped, jaw tight, and did not finish the sentence. Hiruzen felt the familiar ache settle into his chest, the one that had lived there, dull and constant, for 13 years now. "That is not dumb, Naruto. That is an entirely reasonable thing to wish for, and an entirely painful thing to wake from. Do you think it'll ever actually happen? Like for real, not just in a dream?" Hiruzen considered his answer carefully, unwilling to offer false comfort but equally unwilling to extinguish whatever fragile hope the boy still carried. "I believe," he said slowly, "that people are often slower to change their hearts than they should be, and that this village, in particular, carries burdens and fears from its past that are not fair to place upon your shoulders, but which it has placed there regardless. I cannot promise you that every person in Konoha will come to see you clearly, but I can tell you, with complete honesty, that the people who matter most, the ones who take the time to truly know you, rather than simply reacting to fears and rumors that have nothing to do with who you actually are, those people, Naruto, will come. It may take time. It may take more patience than feels fair to ask of a boy your age. But I do not believe you will spend your whole life as alone as you have sometimes felt these past years." Naruto did not answer, but something in the set of his shoulders eased, fractionally, and when Hiruzen suggested they simply sit together quietly for the remainder of the session rather than resume training, the boy nodded and, after a moment's hesitation, shifted slightly closer along the stone, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. They did not train that day. Hiruzen judged correctly that some lessons mattered more than technique. It was around the 2-month mark of their secret training, with the tree-climbing exercise now largely mastered, Naruto able to walk the full height of the oak and even attempt a few tentative steps along a horizontal branch, that a new figure entered the periphery of Naruto's daily life, one who would prove, in time, to matter a great deal more than either he or Hiruzen yet realized. Yumino Iruka was, at the time, a Chunin instructor recently reassigned to a junior tutoring rotation within the Academy's preparatory program, tasked with providing basic literacy and arithmetic instruction to a small handful of village children not yet old enough for formal academy enrollment, but whose circumstances, orphaned, or otherwise lacking a stable home environment for early education, made informal group tutoring a practical necessity. Naruto had been placed in his rotation 3 weeks prior, one name among a small roster, and Iruka had approached the assignment with the same competent, slightly weary professionalism he brought to most of his duties, expecting little beyond an unremarkable handful of ordinary young children requiring ordinary attention. He had not expected Uzumaki Naruto to be, of all things, attentive. "All right," Iruka said, on a bright mid-morning some weeks into the rotation, standing before a small chalkboard in a modest classroom set aside for the tutoring sessions, 5 children of varying ages seated at low desks before him. "Today we're going to work on basic multiplication. Can anyone tell me what happens when we multiply a number by itself?" He expected, based on prior sessions, a scattering of half-raised hands, a few confused stares, Perhaps one child determined to answer regardless of whether they actually understood the question. What he did not expect was for Naruto, who, in Iruka's admittedly limited prior experience with him, had seemed like precisely the sort of restless, easily distracted child prone to daydreaming through lessons and causing minor disruptions out of sheer boredom, to have his hand up first, and to answer, correctly and with evident understanding, before Iruka had even finished calling on him. "You get a square number," Naruto said. "Like if you do 3 times 3, that's 9, and if you draw it out as a square shape it's got 3 little boxes on each side." Iruka blinked. Yes, exactly right, Naruto." "Very good." It was not an isolated incident. Over the following days, Iruka found himself watching the boy with increasing, quiet curiosity. Naruto's handwriting, while still rough, had visibly improved from the ragged scrawl noted in his prior tutoring records. His questions, when he asked them, showed a genuine grasping after understanding rather than the reflexive, attention-seeking interruptions Iruka had half expected based on the boy's village reputation. And there was, threaded through all of it, a new quality of stillness in the boy that seemed almost incongruous with the loud, restless energy Iruka recalled from brief prior encounters, a capacity to sit quietly and focus that Iruka would not, in his professional experience, have expected to develop naturally in a child so young, especially one whose home circumstances offered so little in the way of structure or guidance. "You've been working hard," Iruka observed one afternoon, after the other children had filed out and Naruto lingered, as he sometimes did, to ask a final question about the day's lesson. "I mean it as a genuine compliment. Your focus has improved a great deal these past weeks." Naruto's face did something complicated, surprise first, quickly followed by a flush of pleased embarrassment, and beneath both, something more guarded, the wary flicker of a child unaccustomed to unqualified praise and instinctively bracing for the catch that experience had taught him usually followed it. "Thanks, Sensei," he said. "I've just been trying really hard at some stuff lately. Guess it's helping with the school stuff too." "What sort of stuff?" Iruka asked, curious despite himself. Naruto hesitated, and Iruka watched the boy's expression cross briefly into something like calculation, an unusual thing to see on such a young, generally transparent face, and a small warning sign, had Iruka known to read it as such, that whatever Naruto was working so diligently at was something he had been asked, or had decided, to keep private. "Just practice stuff," Naruto said vaguely. "Breathing and focusing and stuff like that. There's this old guy who's been helping me out." "That's good to hear," Iruka said, deciding not to press further, though he filed the vague answer away with mild, professional curiosity. It was not uncommon for orphan children in the village to have informal mentors, retired shinobi, kindly neighbors, occasionally a member of the Hokage's own extended staff acting out of simple compassion, and Iruka saw no particular reason to interrogate a clearly positive development in a child whose life, by all available accounts, had offered rather too few positive developments to date. What he did notice, and what stayed with him rather more persistently over the following weeks, was the simple fact that Naruto, unlike the somewhat exaggerated, troublemaking reputation that preceded him through certain corners of the village, was, in Iruka's direct and repeated experience, a genuinely engaged, curious, and increasingly disciplined young student, entirely at odds with the dismissive whispers Iruka had occasionally overheard from other villagers regarding the boy. It planted, in Iruka's mind, the first small seed of a question he would carry with him for some time, a quiet, growing suspicion that the village's collective judgment of this particular child might be built on considerably less solid ground than most people assumed, and rather more on old fears that had nothing whatsoever to do with the boy actually sitting in front of him, working diligently through his multiplication tables with a fierce, hopeful concentration that Iruka found, against his own professional detachment, increasingly difficult not to admire. Naruto, for his part, said nothing to Hiruzen about Iruka-sensei's growing attention for some time, not out of any deliberate secrecy but simply because it did not occur to him, in the busy tumble of his days, that it was information worth reporting. It was only when Hiruzen, during one of their morning sessions, asked in passing how his tutoring lessons were progressing that the subject came up at all. "Pretty good, actually," Naruto said, wobbling slightly as he attempted to balance on one foot atop a thin branch, chakra flickering unevenly at the sole of his sandal. "There's this new teacher, Iruka-sensei. He's kind of strict, but he's actually really nice once you get past that. He said my focus has gotten a lot better lately. Has he? Hiruzen said, with carefully neutral interest, watching the boy's balance with a critical eye. And did he ask why your focus has improved? Yeah, but I just said I've been practicing breathing and stuff with some old guy. I didn't say anything about, Naruto wobbled dangerously, caught himself, and grinned down at the ground far below with evident relief at not having fallen. The secret stuff. I remembered what you said, about keeping it quiet. Good, Hiruzen said, relieved, though beneath the relief he felt a small, unexpected pang of something almost like guilt. It was no small thing, he reflected, to ask an 8-year-old boy, already isolated, already accustomed to keeping his own counsel far more than any child should have to carry yet another secret, however well-intentioned the reason behind it. That Naruto had done so without complaint, and apparently without even much conscious effort, spoke to a loyalty and discretion that struck Hiruzen as simultaneously admirable and quietly heartbreaking. This Irika? Hiruzen said, after a moment's consideration. Yumino Irika, is it? I recall the name, a Chunin, formerly of the mission desk rotation, transferred to junior instruction some months back. A steady, capable shinobi, if my memory of his file serves. It is good, I think, that he has taken a genuine interest in your progress. It would do you good, Naruto, to have more people in your life who see you clearly, who notice your effort and your growth rather than simply reacting to old rumors. He seems pretty cool, Naruto agreed, hopping down from the branch with the easy, unconcerned grace of a boy who had, over 2 months of practice, largely stopped fearing falls from moderate heights. Maybe when I actually start at the academy for real, he'll be one of my teachers. Perhaps he will, Hiruzen said, and something in his tone, a faint, private note of satisfaction, suggested that he considered this a rather promising possibility indeed, though he did not elaborate further, and Naruto, absorbed in brushing dirt from his palms, did not think to ask. The morning training continued, steady and unglamorous, through the changing of the seasons. Summer's heat gave way to the cooler winds of early autumn, the leaves in the clearing behind the monument turning gold and beginning, one by one, to fall, a development Naruto found faintly amusing, given how much of his recent education had revolved around leaves in rather more literal fashion. Hiruzen introduced, gradually, a handful of additional exercises meant to further refine Naruto's chakra control. Water walking, attempted first in a shallow, calm pond at the edge of the training grounds, which proved, if anything, more immediately punishing than tree climbing had been, given the boy's tendency to simply sink straight through the surface on his first several dozen attempts, emerging each time soaked to the skin and sputtering but, notably, laughing rather more often than he grew frustrated. This is so much harder than the tree thing, Naruto complained, wringing water from his jacket after his 40th or so failed attempt, teeth chattering slightly in the cool autumn air. Water is a less stable, less forgiving surface than solid bark, Hiruzen agreed. It requires more constant, more responsive adjustment of your chakra output. You cannot simply set a steady flow and maintain it, as you largely can with tree climbing, but must instead continuously sense and correct for the water's natural movement beneath you. It is, in many respects, considerably closer to the kind of dynamic control that true elemental manipulation will eventually demand of you. So it's actually good that it's hard. It is precisely because it is hard that it will serve you so well, Hiruzen said. Now again please, before you catch a chill standing about complaining. Naruto groaned theatrically but waded back toward the pond's edge, gathering his focus, and tried once more. By the time the first frost arrived, turning the grass in the clearing crisp and white each morning, Naruto could stand, briefly, and with considerable effort, on the surface of the pond without sinking, could walk the height of the oak and back without a single misstep, and had, on several proud occasions, managed to hold 3 separate leaves steady across both palms and his forehead simultaneously for a full 2 minutes without falter. It was, Hiruzen judged, watching the boy's progress with the quiet, unhurried satisfaction of a man who understood, better than most, the true value of patient, foundational work, more than sufficient groundwork for what would need to come next. Naruto, Hiruzen said, on a crisp morning in late autumn, as frost still clung to the shadowed edges of the clearing and their breath fogged visibly in the cold air. I believe you have reached a point in your training where we might begin to discuss, in somewhat more detail, the nature of what lies ahead of us. Naruto, who had just finished a satisfying stretch of tree-walking practice and was in the process of catching his breath, looked up with immediate, undisguised interest. You mean the elemental stuff? The actual fire and lightning and everything? In time, yes, Hiruzen said. But before we begin true elemental training, I want you to understand clearly something important about the particular nature of the gift you carry, something that I believe, if left unaddressed, could prove genuinely dangerous to you, both in terms of your physical safety and in terms of your development as a shinobi. He settled himself on the familiar flat stone, and gestured for Naruto to join him. Most shinobi, Hiruzen began, once Naruto had seated himself, cross-legged and attentive in a way that would have astonished anyone who knew him only by village reputation, possess a single dominant chakra nature. They train that nature, deeply and exhaustively, over years, sometimes decades, of dedicated practice, until their command of it becomes second nature, near instinctive, capable of being deployed in the heat of battle without conscious thought. This depth of mastery, this singular focus, is what allows a shinobi to reliably perform advanced, powerful techniques under pressure. Okay, Naruto said, following along carefully. You, Hiruzen continued, possess not one dominant nature, but 5, plus the additional combined nature of wood release beneath them. This is, as I told you when we first discovered it, an extraordinary and rare gift. But I want you to understand, Naruto, that it is also, in a very real sense, a more difficult path than the one walked by shinobi with a single strong affinity. Naruto's brow furrowed. How come? Isn't having more stuff just better? Like better than only having one thing? In terms of raw versatility, ultimately yes, Hiruzen said. A shinobi who can call upon all 5 natures, once properly trained, possesses a flexibility in combat that few others in this world can match, able to counter an opponent's element with its natural inverse, able to combine techniques in ways close to those with narrower training. But that ultimate versatility comes at a cost during the learning process, and it is this cost I want you to understand clearly, so that you do not become discouraged when your path looks different from what you might expect. He picked up a stick from the ground beside him and, in the frost-dusted dirt before them, began to sketch a simple diagram, 5 circles, arranged in a rough pentagon, each labeled with a small symbol representing one of the 5 natures. Imagine, he said, that mastering any one nature to a meaningful, combat-ready degree requires, on average, a certain quantity of dedicated training time and effort. Let us say, for the sake of illustration, 1 measure of effort. A shinobi with a single natural affinity spends the whole of that 1 measure of effort deepening their command of that single nature, and emerges, at the end of it, with a correspondingly deep and instinctive mastery. He tapped each of the 5 circles in turn. You, Naruto, must eventually spend that same measure of effort 5 times over, once for each nature, simply to reach an equivalent baseline of competency across the board. This will take you longer, in raw calendar time, to reach a battle-ready standard in any single element, than it would take a shinobi focused exclusively on that one element from the start. Do you understand what I am telling you? Naruto stared at the diagram in the dirt, working through the implication with visible effort. So, even though I've got way more stuff to work with, it's actually gonna take me longer to get good at any one of them? Compared to, like Sasuke, if he ends up being crazy good at just fire? Hiruzen was, not for the first time, quietly impressed by the boy's ability to grasp an abstract concept and apply it, unprompted, to a concrete comparison. That is an accurate summary, yes. It is entirely possible, likely, even, that over the coming years, you will encounter peers who appear to be progressing more quickly than you in raw elemental technique, because they are pouring the whole of their effort into a single nature while you divide yours across 5, plus the combined nature of wood release. This can be discouraging, if you do not understand the reason behind it, and I have seen more than one promising young shinobi abandon a rare and valuable gift out of frustration at a perceived slowness of progress, when in truth they were simply climbing a taller, more difficult mountain than those around them. But I'll get there eventually, right? Naruto said, a note of anxious uncertainty creeping into his voice that Hiruzen had not heard from him in some weeks, an old, familiar fear of being found wanting resurfacing beneath the surface of his usual bravado. I mean, it'll just take longer, but I'll still get just as strong, right? Stronger even 'cause I'll have all 5? I believe so, Hiruzen said, with careful, deliberate certainty, meeting the boy's eyes directly. I believe, given sufficient time, sufficient patience, and sufficient discipline, all qualities I have watched you develop steadily these past months, Naruto, more than I ever expected when we began, you will not merely reach the same baseline of skill as a single affinity shinobi. You will, eventually, surpass what any of them could achieve alone, precisely because the versatility you will eventually command has no true equivalent among those with narrower gifts. But I want you to walk this path with clear eyes, understanding both its difficulty and its eventual reward, rather than expecting an easy or a quick road to mastery. Roots, Naruto, before branches. A tree that grows its roots deep and wide before it reaches for the sky will weather storms that topple trees which grew tall too quickly, with roots too shallow to hold them steady. This is the principle I want you to carry with you through everything that follows. Patience with the depth of your own foundation will, in time, allow you to grow taller and stronger than those who rushed ahead of you. Naruto sat with this for a long moment, the frost slowly beginning to melt in patches around them as the sun climbed higher, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a quiet, settled resolve that Hiruzen found more moving than any amount of loud enthusiasm could have been. Okay, he said. Roots before branches. I can do that. I mean, I'll probably still get impatient sometimes, 'cause that's just kind of how I am. But I get why it matters, and I'm not gonna give up just 'cause it takes longer than for other people. If anything, a familiar, stubborn grin began creeping back across his face. That just means when I finally do get good at all this stuff, it's gonna mean even more, you know? 'Cause I actually earned it, the hard way, instead of just getting lucky with one easy thing. Hiruzen smiled, warm and genuine, the particular smile he reserved for moments when the weight of his office eased, briefly, beneath the simpler, purer satisfaction of watching a promising student grasp something important. That, he said, is precisely the attitude that will see you through everything ahead of you, Naruto. Precisely that. They spent the remainder of that morning's session not in physical training, but in quieter conversation, Hiruzen sketching out, in broad strokes, the shape of the years ahead, continued chakra control refinement through the winter months, the beginning of true elemental exercises once spring arrived and Naruto's control had deepened further, and, running alongside all of it, Naruto's eventual formal enrollment in the Ninja Academy proper, where he would need to navigate the delicate balance of appearing, to his classmates and instructors, as an ordinary, if perhaps unusually focused, student, while continuing his extraordinary secret training in the early mornings before each school day began. It's gonna be weird, Naruto admitted, as they finally rose to part ways for the day, having to pretend at school like I'm not doing any of this. Like, what if I get excited and accidentally show off or something? That, Hiruzen said, is precisely why we continue to emphasize control above all else. The tighter your command over your own chakra and your own emotional responses, the less risk there is of an unintended slip in front of your classmates. But I will not pretend the discipline required of you is small, Naruto, and I do not expect perfection. If a slip does occur, come to me directly, and we will address it together, rather than allowing worry over secrecy to become its own burden on top of everything else. Okay, Naruto said, and then, with the sudden, unguarded warmth that occasionally broke through his usual boisterous exterior, added, thanks, old man. For all of this. Nobody's ever. He stopped, cleared his throat, visibly embarrassed by the direction the sentence had been heading. Anyway. Thanks. You are entirely welcome, Naruto, Hiruzen said, and watched the boy sprint off down the deer trail toward the village, backpack bouncing, breath fogging in the cold morning air, carrying with him, though he did not yet fully know it, the deepening roots of a gift that would, in the years ahead, grow into something that would reshape not only his own life, but the shape of the entire shinobi world around him. Behind him, alone in the frost-touched clearing, Hiruzen allowed himself a long, quiet moment of reflection before making his own way back toward the tower and the mounting duties of his office, duties which, this particular morning, felt somehow lighter for the hour just spent, as they so often did now, in the company of a boy the rest of the village had too long, too carelessly, failed to see clearly. Roots before branches, he thought, echoing his own words back to himself as he walked. Let us hope, old friend, he added silently, addressing the thought toward the distant, carved stone face of Hashirama Senju looming high above the village on the monument's face. that whatever guided this gift to root itself in this particular boy knew, as I am only now beginning to fully understand, exactly what kind of foundation he would need beneath him, before the branches of what he may yet become are finally permitted to reach toward the sky.